There he is. There's Andrew Luber. How you doing, Andrew
Daniel, how
Luber?
are you?
I'm good.
I'm dog walking right now. I took
You're
on
such a
another
good dad.
side job. No, it's not my dogs. It's the side hustle.
Oh my gosh. Oh my
I
gosh.
know.
But that's brilliant because you got to walk your own dog. So now you're taking care of your own responsibilities while making money for it. Oh my gosh. That's
It,
what we ought to all do dog walking at the net. That will be like our thing.
yeah, everyone at once. The camera's pointed like this. Well, everyone.
Yeah, everyone, all talking and dog walking. It will be solidarity and different things. And the great Philip Shinn, it is good to see you, sir. I am doing well. We have planted grass seed. We are surviving. We had fun yesterday. But I'd be curious what you fine gentlemen are talking about or thinking about. What's going through your fine minds, everyone?
Daniel. Man,
Philip, Philip.
what? Let me start off by saying what a joy it is to be on this planet at the same time as you,
Aw,
and
you're gonna make me blush. I love you.
how wonderful it is to cross paths on the American cyber empire. I don't know who coined that phrase, but I love that. Of like, I understand you run a wedding venue.
That's the
I
rumor.
would love to have a party there with everyone from the net. I'll marry a horse named Nietzsche. You can
Perfect.
facilitate.
Perfect.
Put
We've
me
got the
put me in a
space.
straight
Yeah,
jacket. Put
straight.
me in a straight jacket as I say, I do, and then we'll dance. We'll party. Because I think that's what we should do when we get together. And I'm wondering energetically, what's the difference between people who calculate versus those who celebrate? The idea that we're thrown into this situation where we are forced to be these goal seeking individuals, knowing that as soon as we reach a certain goal, new ones will sprout up, kind of Hydra like, while at the same time, there's opportunities for us to celebrate being as such. And this is sort of like an unmotivated flow of energy that you see sometimes with babies, right? So they have all these impulses and
Yeah.
they're trying to get their intention and their impulse synced. And the big people around them are going, yay, yay, you figured out how to like stand up. Yay, figured out how to walk without, you know, some kind of like toy lawnmower or something like that. And I wonder if at the end of his life, if it was an aberration, right? That Nietzsche went mad. I think Deleuze says it wasn't. Of course, there was a bunch of stuff that happened with the sister and all that. Um, but I wonder just how much of celebration happens with kind of like not talking and calculating so much.
Mm,
just
mm.
just dance, 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 dance. And how much of a man's life, given his aeon, does he spend at market calculating versus I guess it would be like a holy day, you know, just kind of soaking it up. How does that fit into the Negantropic breadboard? And how does that fit into Nick Land, the great conversation that was had with the maestro himself, who's saying basically we are going to calculate ourselves off this planet.
That's beautiful, Philip Shen. Love it. And Michael, Andrew Parsons, Dimitri, it's a pleasure to see you. I'll pass it on to Mr. Luber. I love this idea of the difference between calculation and celebration. Funny enough, I think people who do philosophy best find out that the party gets better when you do philosophy, not because you intend to do philosophy, because when a conversation just follows what comes with it, it ends up with a certain philosophical character that also brings with it the celebration of understanding. And like, yes, grasp it. Yes, grasp it. There's also a way in which I think philosophy not tied to celebration dies, right? If you're not doing philosophy to celebrate life or to gain some sort of celebration of what it means to be alive and to defend the things that you celebrate and to have a better grasp on the things you celebrate, I think you get in trouble. I think that you mentioned Sabbath. I think the notion of Sabbath became much more difficult for people to grasp when it was separated from a notion of celebration. Like you're celebrating like festival, leisure, piper, all of these things I think kind of go together. And in fact, I do think calculation and celebration exist in a certain tension because celebration tends to be best precisely because it is not calculatable, it is experienced. It is a kind of bulwark, a kind of defense against the tyranny of calculation. But here's the problem. To be able to celebrate, you tend to have to be good at calculation because the world is trying to take away all of your avenues of celebration. It's trying to take away your joy. It is trying to make you, and if you have joy, it makes you naive. It makes the only way to get joy to be closed-minded to the world or to avoid things, right? So I think the other thing I think about, and I'll give it to Luber here, Bonhoeffer, and I use it all the time, that distinction between cheap grace and costly grace. Cheap grace being whenever you sin, you just ask God to forgive you your sins and just keep going. Costly grace is where you take up your cross, subjective destitution, so on and so forth. I think cheap celebration, there's a difference between that and costly celebration. And costly celebration seems to require calculation to get to. But unfortunately, in the process of calculating to get to costly celebration, you train yourself out of the habits and joy necessary for celebration. All of the things we need to mature seem to simultaneously perhaps train us out of the capacity of the reason to do those things. And your frenemy brain is all in the business of making you not realize that's happening to you because it is simultaneously making you blind and making you think that that's not occurring. But that's happening to the other people, but not me. I'm different. Yeah, funny how that works. But I love that distinction. But let me give it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber, I hope that you are making millions walking those dogs, like millions upon millions. Bam! The empire begins.
One dog at a time. I'm sorry. Give me literally 1 second.
Oh, it's perfect. It's a chance to dance. Everyone dance. Dun, 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 dun. No calculation here. We're just gonna dance. And no calculation, just gonna dance. And the only reason we are able to so dance is because we calculated to get here. Costly calculation. We're trying to celebrate. Celebration, celebration.
I don't know
Okay,
why
yeah.
it
What was
reminds
that?
me of Michael Scott. I don't know why that reminded me of Michael Scott, right? Like in some way. I don't know. Like something
He looked up. He was like,
Michael Scott.
Michael Scott was looking up wherever he is, like that, like Augustine picture. So anyway, Mr. Luber, what were you going to say on celebration
Oh
and
my God.
calculation, so on and so forth?
So, Philip, those were really kind words. It's also great to be on this planet with you and everyone at the net at the same time. It's a blessing. And yeah, I mean, I think to make a distinction, like a clean distinction, a binary one between the two, might not be fruitful, just because in the way, like if you're, it's like dance, 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 dance. That sounds very, you know, calculative. Like if you say, like almost like uh phonetically in a funny sense, it's like dance, 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 dance. You keep saying it, it starts to sound like 1 0 1 0 1 0 1 0 1 0. Like it's it's there is a certain calculation, but it's I think the distinction that is being brought out is like there's a certain type of calculation where you're grabbing and it's becoming not the thing in which you started calculating in the first place, versus a grasping where it's like a not just an upkeep or a maintaining, but a like a sprouting. There's a growth and an evolution to the way you grab it, which has to do with what I've been thinking about, which I think is directly related here. Basically, when you think of a framework that's nonlinear, what are the concepts that get touted? Now, I think when you think about that, when you think about like the nonlinear aspect to a framework, there's a certain anti-grasping that's occurring. There's a certain letting go inherently for you to recognize that, okay, I have a framework and I'm approaching it from a nonlinear way, the what this framework is. When you actually have to start making decisions and you actually have to start building and it becomes actualized, you have to make these almost finite decisions. If you're thinking about it, the infinite, finite, nonlinear, linear, is the same for the sake of this argument. there's a certain, okay, I'm completely not grabbing with the infinity perspective in the framework, but as it becomes actualized, there is a certain grabbing, but it has to be gripped in such a way that it conforms to the context at hand. So it's like if you grab in a way, like it seems like Hegel, he was trying to grab a philosophy in a way where it would apply to all possible philosophies. And like young Heidegger would like he has a lot of reasons that it's like vulgar, I think, for Heidegger. And like that's kind of one of them in my mind, where if you have to only grab, like using a framework or a system, you can only grab it in a way that's particular to a context. If you try to apply it to all possible contexts, like in your mind, you're either not grabbing it at all or you're grabbing it too tight where it's not the thing anymore. So I think the way to like not over calculate is to basically say the limit of calculation is per the particular context in which I'm trying to calculate. And I can't think about it outside of that particular context. And I think that's very hard because I think human beings have the tendency, like I said, I think like 2 nets ago, to totalize. It's like, okay, I'm going to calculate in this given context, but it's hard to not think about this given context in all possible contexts. It's hard for your mind to be like, okay, this, I'm constructing a sports game. How does this apply to other sports games? I think when you're approaching something from the infinite, like a philosopher is, with a framework, it's hard to just like stick with just this particular game. But then the problem is, if you're approaching it like not a philosopher, you're just going to miss the nonlinear dimension, the infinite dimension completely. And that's almost like even worse in a certain sense. So it seems like, and this relates to like the Lacan thing, like where is this alienation taking place? Because like if you are like with desire, just to like draw a line here, and then I'll pass it off. I've been talking, but like it's the same thing. It's like, okay, I have an internal alienation, and because I have such a clean internal alienation of sorts, I kind of know what I want. Let's just say. But let's say I'm in tune with that alienation. Then it's like, I don't really know what I want because you're so in tune with the alienation internally. So it's the thing, okay, if you're a philosopher, you kind of know, you're kind of like not in tune with your alienation. You kind of know what you want, what the inquiry of investigation you have in mind. It might be hard to grasp and stuff, but you kind of have already a sense of how you're alienated from the other, such that you don't know how you're alienated in the other, and hence an investigation needs to occur. Where like a non-philosopher from this perspective, it's like, okay, well, I am completely not in tune with the other and how I'm alienated, and therefore I don't even know how to investigate at all. So I just think it's a problem where I think the philosopher's point of view, it's hard to not totalize, but from the everyday man colloquial perspective, it's hard to actually have something that has like getting in touch with that intrinsic motivation, getting in touch with like an internal consistency of sorts. It's very hard for the everyday man to even get there because they don't have any kind of awareness of how they're not understanding their alienation with the other. But yeah, I said a lot. I hope the Lacan spillover translated well, but those Lacanians out there, feel free to correct me. But I'll pass it off.
You need to charge an extra $100 to the dog owners to overhear philosophy like that, because now like that's some pretty premium like dog whispering right there. So, I think so. And Michelle, we had a dance party for about 3 minutes. I know. Yeah, don't be upset. I'm sorry. We'll redo it in the kitchen. I promise. No, that's very lovely. I'll give it to Philip and Michael here. Well, there's a few things. First off, that's interesting on the notion of the grasping, because there's almost a way in which, like, the problem is we're grasping versus celebrating. Like, if I go to Levinas on the idea of what's the difference between the infinite and the totality. So if you experience the person, the face, as an infinity, what's the correct response in front of the infinity? To maybe dance? Like, what is the response that is a testament to infinity versus totality? Like, if I use the language of grasping, it's interesting because grasping has a kind of totality to it, right? Like, I grasped it. Whereas when you say, it's like, I grasped how to get in front of the face, and now I let go, and I let go, and I dance, right? So it's kind of interesting where, what else do you do before the infinite but celebrate? If you're not celebrating, there's a sense in which the infinite is you don't actually, you may call it the infinite, but it's just in word only. Like, if it's actually the infinite as the face or the beautiful, there's some sort of celebration that naturally occurs, right? And if calculation does not lead to where calculation fails as celebration, then that's a problem. Because I think celebration is an interesting word too, because if we think of a Master Eckhart or the that of which transcends knowledge, the negative theology, all of these different things, there's a way in which the failure of, if you really truly understood the point at which your thought failed before the beatific vision, that would be the correct response to a failure of thought is celebration. But we tend to go, no, the correct thought to a failure is silence, or, you know, like your brain blowing up or something, like that movie. And in a way, there's some truth to that. But really, if you really get what it means that your thought failed in that apophatic situation, that's a reason for celebration. And that's funny because it's almost like the point of all my calculation and thinking has arrived at its failure. And I think in the sense that like an understanding of Hegel at absolute knowing is precisely taking joy in the failure of grasping. Like, what you make part of your system is a failure of grasping, and you make that limit part of it. But then the question is, what's the proper response to that? You know, celebration. And actually, to this point, I think that's interesting because this may suggest, and then I'll give it to Philip and Michael, why calculation and celebration go together. In my experience, most people have no idea how to throw a party. They have no idea. Throwing a party is really hard, actually. Like, having a good time is not easy. So what do most people do when they have a party? They drink. And I'm not against alcohol, but like the way it's the cheap party, we'll just stop thinking, right? Because so let's stop calculation and then we'll celebrate, right? But to really throw a good party, you do the fulfillment of calculation. You don't turn off your thinking. You enter the fullness of thinking. My favorite parties usually have jazz improvisation. They're usually like not just dancing to music, but playing music, or there's a lot of improvisation. There's a lot of like live comedy, like there's art. This is where it's almost like art almost just kind of seems like it has to be part of the best parties because there's something participatory. Have a wonderful time partying, Mr. Luber. I know you're gonna make with the puppies. Oh, you include taking the dogs to a party? Oh, frick, you need to be charging at least $800. I mean, that's ridiculous. The service you provide, the service. But anyway, it's like there's something where art is the point where you find celebration thanks to calculation. That's exactly right, Mr. Luber. So like I find that the best parties are not just people standing around trying to turn off their calculating brain. It is a product of the fullness of calculation that forgets itself in something beyond itself, right? So it's interesting. So again, cheap, costly calculation. And then maybe, to Mr. Land, maybe what can AI throw a good party? Maybe it can, maybe not, but maybe that's where the human kind of gets in there, right? That we get really good at throwing parties because we calculate the angles like a military officer and strategize how to party in a way AI is not. And our parties will be better, and everyone on the frat street will come to our place because we actually like throw a really good party, right? So no one's going to that freaking Nick Land like slum place. They're coming over here, man. So anyway, let me get to Philip and then Michael. Philip.
But they'll be rocking the work, you know, they'll be rocking the office, you know, which is where most people party, to be honest. Like I see some older people treat church like a club, you know. I gotta say hallelujah, you know, like vibrate the chambers of my body. And you know, speaking of, that's what Meister Eckhart says when he was asked, you know, what do angels do? And he's like, they don't do anything, they celebrate. So I'm gonna push back a little bit at you, Luber, and say it's actually the perfect distinction. I don't think there's a better one that any human has ever come up with. But what is going on between celebrating and Calculating is in like Taoist language could be called like acting by not acting, doing versus happening, and it's like this distinction can be very, 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 very difficult for a certain type of thinking to grasp, like almost ungraspable if you get into like a left brain lock of being McGilchrist. And one of the let me see if I can find some language Daniel will like. Okay, so there's a dude back in the day who talked about like looking at the lilies in the field, right? Or like checking out the birds in the air. This guy. What is he saying? What I think he's getting at is like everything is happening. You've just kind of forgotten. You've forgotten that it's all happening because on top of this, you've built model upon model, structure upon structure, whatever you can call it, constructing idols, but it's like identifying with a certain type of mental image rather than it's like confusing a psychological and an existential truth. The idea being like, you live, you're born, you live, you die. And then, but people are like, no, but my name's Michelle and my name's Michael and my name's OG Rose. And it's like, yeah, that's true. It's not that that's not true. It's not completely true. And then I think it becomes this question of how much of the game do you play in your time, knowing that you enter into these interesting game theoretic dynamics of people being like, I don't know, I'm gonna set up the laws so that you know I can like minimize my own risk and maximize my own gain and make like the risks on everyone else like very, very tough so that they're stuck in this calculative mode, thinking it's the apex of human existence. And this is, like where we found ourselves in Plato's cave, right? So it's like, oh yeah, this is um, what we have to do in order to live versus, um, us already being alive and looking then at the proliferation of needs we have added to ourselves because death anxiety, status anxiety, like all these things where we're just like we've been made to think we're vulnerable creatures. We're actually significant beings. But like very few people are going to be like, no, you are an actual significant. I like very few advertisers. Uh, but the people who do are sometimes like just seen as crazy. They're just like, what? No, but they didn't do anything to, earn that moniker. And you're like, actually, what they're doing or what's happening to them is much bigger than what happens in this lifetime because it's the result of hundreds of millions of years of life overcoming itself. But we just lose that plot. And it's just like, I work at, Intel and I hit the buttons and then I get the monies and I do it because I'm afraid of what life would be like without health insurance. So every once in a while I get really drunk at the Christmas party and that's a good time, let me tell you. But we can't have too much of that. Couldn't have too much of that. That would be very, very dangerous. So I don't know, like that, does that make more sense with the frame as far as like, um, and then even with like impulse and intention, like I'm thinking just because I got two young nephews, like how amazingly adept we must look to even like be able to tell when we have to urinate. I bet they're just like,
Can I jump?
yeah,
Can I
yeah,
say
yeah.
something real quick?
Please do.
Sorry. You just really struck a nerve in a good way. Um, so like to me, you're kind of like addressing like what I would call like the context set problem. So like basically there's like the universal life context in which you can like situate your story in. And then you can go like give you an example of a different route where it's like a future dystopian where it's like this dystopia really takes seriously of everybody's individualism to the point where any type of like societal or you and the other type of behavior or decision that needed to be made, you have to go through like a deeply bureaucratic process to vet your particular context. Like it seems like what you're suggesting, there's like these two like very distinct pathways where it's like you're super individualistic and then in my mind it becomes very bureaucratic, or you're very universalist of sorts. And you can't go one or the other per se, but what you're saying just brings out the problem of like with law, like how how do you conduct law based, like how do you judge where law should belong to in a toward a specific context, because you don't know how you should approach that context, if it should be, if that context set should be the totality of life like you're saying, or like a super hyper individualistic context set. And it just seems like there's a lot of decisions and a lot of ways of how you need to understand the approach. So like I understand the distinction you're making, but I guess what I'm wondering is like I was just listening to this Hegel thing, so I'm going to use a Hegel term. What's the absolution here? What's absolving us from this short circuit of sorts is what I'm because I feel like you have your finger on something. So I just wanted to see if you have a suggestion of absolution.
Yeah, I think it has to do with first an acknowledgement that the highest value has turned into whatever you want to call it, a 3% increase per year of GDP. Like this is a non-trivial number when it comes to like how much we work and how we view our impulses and intentions. And I'm saying like it feels like we're in this like hangover based on some kind of Protestant work ethic where we identify our worth with our work or something, and that could be done by our machines. Like it's not anything super new. Then the question would be like a little more I'm not going to say like follow your bliss, but like it would just be a shakeup of how much time we spend doing the calculating versus, it could be from a 5 to 3 day work week. What would that look like? Uh, it might be like we don't need screens anymore, so we can, stop uh, looting the Congo, etc. But I think that's like one of the ideas is like this. There, yeah, I think I got some with Lacan too. So I think like a lot of people's jouissance comes from sadism. Like I think a lot of teachers, like a lot of our education system are like people who have this love for telling other people what to do, like ordering people around, and they like can't make it to politics or something. And so they like they're like, cool, I'll do it with third graders. And ultimately, I think the idea, Andrew, when it comes to what I'm looking for, and I have no idea, and it's horrifying because I know everything that's happened up until now isn't going to work, and I don't know what to do. It has to do with what is this Susan Collins book? It's like the Confessions of Franny Langdon, right? You have this person who kills their master, the slave who kills their master. This is like the slave who kills the master signifier, right? So I am under the imaginative foreclosure of the zeitgeist and like how to find symbolic um, lines of flight that aren't like completely schizoid, but are like kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out to move the coordinates of the map. Because I think like what you're saying is true when it comes to people who don't do philosophy are just like, I have no idea how my life could be different. But at the same time, you're like, hey, like 10 years ago, you weren't scrolling TikTok for 4 hours a day. Like, so you kind of have like a little bit of an idea, right? Like a little bit. And sort of building on that, to what I honestly don't know. But I have a feeling that it would involve the amount of time we work and the amount of time we have off work.
No, delightful. I'll give it to Michael, Mr. Jock, and Miss Rivera. Good to see you. We've been talking about celebration versus calculation as a kind of dialectic almost, and then the notion at what point does celebration end and begin, and calculation a threat to celebration. And then there was like a 3-minute dance party, which will live in shrouded mystery forever. But being told that it occurred, but not seeing it, gives your imagination space by which to seek to be moved by the love of that image toward that which moves the sun and other stars. So I'm very glad that we could help with that. It's very interesting. On a lot of what you're saying, I do wonder if there's been conflations of winning and celebrating. The notion that if we win the game, we'll celebrate. And it turns out that wasn't true. If you win and get the most money, or you win the corporate ladder, or you win retirement, then there will be celebration. And the truth is you can win a game and not feel any celebration. But I think we're kind of trained from school, like if you win at a sport, you almost can't help but celebrate. Your body just kind of celebrates. If you win a board game, you can't help but celebrate. What's very interesting is you can win the corporate game and find yourself not celebrating. And that's the interesting thing. You're almost set up to make that conflation. It seems as if as you get older, finding a feeling of celebration requires like a particular work, right? And this is where calculation seems to come in, right? It's also interesting because like a lot of times, you know, with the idea of finding or thinking about being or capital B being, and it is interesting. You mentioned Matthew, the book of Matthew, and that idea the rocks cry out worship. In religions, there's worship. There's almost this idea that the very seeking of being or the good or the beautiful creates celebration. Like it's almost capital C celebration. The core of reality is a capital C celebration, almost more than a capital B being in a funny way. Like capital B being is that of which kind of reflects a certain celebration. And there are traditions of God singing, you know, Aslan and Narnia singing reality into existence, singing things. Like in the beginning was the song almost, right? And there's that interesting, and obviously we're speaking, you know, like just based on these stories, but there's this idea that I think a lot of the idea of one of the reasons you do calculate is to encounter celebration. But there's something about an incredible difficulty of not forgetting that winning and celebration are not similes, determining what you want to win at that actually is an encounter with celebration, what it is you win at that makes you capable of a subject as celebrating. And maybe the reason calculation is needed is because it is so difficult not to conflate winning and celebration. Maybe that's part of the problem. And so you need to check and balance yourself. Like you know, we've talked about philosophy of self-defense. The brain is the frenemy. If your brain wasn't the frenemy, you might not need to think about thinking so much or be capable of meta-analysis to catch yourself falling into self-deception and different things like that. So it seems as if you need something like calculation to be able to tell the difference between winning and celebration. The very act of which using that celebration makes you bad at telling the difference between winning and celebration. That also simultaneously makes you forget that there was a difference in the first place. So you have to use a tool that causes amnesia in a way in order to not get tricked. But then maybe that's why philosophy also has a constant remember the Lord God that got you out of Egypt. Memory is recall in Plato. Like it's interesting. Great philosophy is like, yes, we know we're dealing with something dangerous, but that's why we're going to emphasize memory and remembering and looking at the past, because you made a great point. Can't you see that 10 years ago you weren't using your phone? Well, that's an act of what? Memorying. But memory creates contrast. That's why memory can be so powerful. And if there was a change, this is like Hegel or philosophy, if there was a change, then there's a contrast that can be thought. Something happened. It's not just merely a matter of opinion. History provides a certain science of the person, of humanity, that's easier to claim is not merely subjective preference. Like if I start using a screen, you can say, oh, well, that's just Daniel's subjective preference. But if there's a historic shift in mass, this would suggest that there was something that changed in the conditions of the society. Are you happier? Are you better? And also note that the way people define winning 10 years ago, even 10 years ago, is different than how they define it now, right? So if you're playing to win versus winning to celebrate, and that looks like playing, funny enough. You return to the place of your beginnings to know it for the first time, then one might be in trouble, but it seems to require calculation to maintain those things. But let me give it to Michael and then back to Mr. Luber. Michael, it's good to see you, sir. I hope you have been well.
It's good to see you as well, and all of you, excuse me, all of you at the net. Great to be back. You were talking about games, and I was thinking, as I think it was when Philip was talking, about like why games are so important. And I think part of what a game does, like in its best form, is that it combines calculation and celebration. So like you have a group of people who are calculating their way to figure out how to, win the game, strategize in the right way. There's like a coordination of minds that are collaborating, that are working together. Even in like solo games, even in like something like tennis, it's like you're strategizing, you're calculating. But then there's also a celebration because there's a very clear like winning and losing. And like there's a very clear demarcation of like what success looks like. And I and so then that got me wondering like, okay, like what's then accounting for like the breakdown of game A? Like if games are so important, like why is this game that like all of us societally are playing is like not working and just destructive? And I think you hit the nail on the head. You like stole the words out of my mouth, which is like we've lost our ability, or maybe we've never had it, to celebrate at the end of our calculating, right? Like there's no sense of what good enough is, or the goalposts of what good enough is always moving, because we feel this existential like pressure to, you know, to get ahead of our neighbors, to keep up with the Joneses, as it were. Um, and so, and then you said something a little while ago, Daniel, where you said like calculation implies a certain like finality, like there's a certain like totality and like certainty of like, oh, I've grasped this, like I've understood this, and it's kind of this like intellectual like kind of, yeah, like groping. Um, and I was thinking like I feel like celebration also implies a certain sense of finality, because there's like a sense of like I've like I've made like a certain deal of progress that I'm like content with, and like content enough to like celebrate this progress. And I think to connect it to something you just said is like celebration requires memory, because it requires you to be able to remember where you started and now where you are. And like the celebration is kind of a, yeah, it's kind of like a recognition of that progress and how beautiful it is. And also I think celebration can just be, can just be a celebration of being, like, without a sense of like, oh, I had to have gotten somewhere to warrant this moment, like, celebratory. Like I think celebration can just be like, holy shit, like I'm alive. And life is amazing, life is beautiful, I'm so grateful. Yeah, let's dance, it off. So yeah, I don't know, I don't really know where I'm going with that, but like speaking of games, and this is kind of very unrelated, but there's this BBC show, and they do this game with their guests called Sit Up, Stand Down, and they have their guests like cold call someone in their contact. He's walking, or doing something. And well, I guess Luber too. I don't know. But the weeks that I've been off, I'm like every time I log on, I'm like, is Philip gonna be sitting or is he gonna be standing? Is his hair gonna be down or is it gonna be in a bun? The possibilities are endless. But yeah, I think this topic is really interesting, and like particularly thinking about like how to structure, I think, in like incentives, like how to like create incentive structures that like produce a happy balance between calculation and celebration. Because yeah, I think if you take the calculation away, then there's no striving. There's no philosophy. There's no like I could be better than I am. You know, like I could try and understand the world more deeply. If it's just purely, you know, this like indulgence in, you know, booze and partying, it's like that becomes very meaningless and very frivolous very quickly. But if you overemphasize calculation, then people are never going to feel, you know, it's kind of like Christianity taken too far, where it's like you're just enshrouded and damned to hell, right? It's like you're never enough. Like you can never celebrate as long as you're on Earth. So yeah, I think this is like really interesting territory of just like thinking existentially for like each of us and for like society at large, um, how to strike that balance. But yeah, I'll pass back.
No, I think that's wonderful. And Philip could also be skiing down a mountain. That's also a possibility, you know, in addition, and also hitting the eggnog bourbon. That is that's another thing that people have to worry about at the Christmas office party. No, that's delightful. You mentioned like there's this kind of finality and celebration. I'm now wondering if there's a few things. If there's a difference between finished and arrived. There's something like with celebration where you feel like I've arrived, yay. Whereas there's a kind of celebration, but then of course you can say, well, don't you arrive at retirement? But this is where this is where I think philosophy becomes like, again, almost necessary, because there are these really fine, subtle distinctions that are not obvious from simply a non-reflected experience, right? Like, yes, we could say in the retirement you arrive, but in my experience, the majority of people's slip of the tongue, the way they naturally speak it of it as a I'm done. They don't think of it. The primary way people speak about it is not an arrival, but I'm a finish. Sure, maybe 10% of the time they say it's great to finally retire, and they have more of an arrival structure in their language. But I think the majority of the time it's a finished, I'm done language that they use. And I think this is important because the truth of a thing almost is a question of the majority speak. Like, what is the majority of the way they talk about the thing? May better get at the truth of it. Maybe not, maybe so, it depends, but it's interesting because metaphorically, I think the majority of people speak of, say, retirement or career as a thing you are done with, more than arrived at something, right? And it's interesting because once you get to a good party, it's like, I've arrived. Oh my gosh, I've finished, I've traveled, I've done everything I need to be, I've arrived, right? So there's a kind of like you completed a process where, and now you are at the thing you arrived to. So it's interesting. There might be a distinction between arrival and finished or done or something that has a completeness to it, but a different character. It's interesting too, because what's the relationship between celebrate and praise, right? I think we celebrate the things that we like. This is where I do think it gets tied to memory, because celebration tends to be a feeling of I'm glad something is alive in me. Like you celebrate your relationship with your grandfather. You celebrate your time at Eunoia. There's a certain celebration where you're saying, I'm glad this thing is alive in me. And it's like you're celebrating that it goes with you. Like it's always with you. It's part of your completion. It's part of what helps you arrive as well, right? And I think we celebrate the things that we almost have a sense we're going to carry with us. If it's the costly celebration, not the cheap celebration of thoughtlessness, right? Like there's a sense, well, what is it Piper says? That the festival leisure is a sense of a kairos time, all time at the same time. I think when you're overwhelmed with celebration, there's a sense that this is going to be with you all the days of your life. Even if you cannot word it, even if you cannot hurt it into words, there's that experience of time. And perhaps if celebration is operating more of a kairos time versus a linear time, as calculation is, maybe a reason the society has conflated celebration as winning is because it cannot think the time of the festival and celebration. It's stuck in a linear time. It's stuck in a chronological time, and winning is what's at the end of the chronology, right? Also, that would cut out the logic of a game because a game kind of operates within its own time, just like a festival does for Piper. It's like it's pointing to something beyond itself. There is a logic here that is not part of the zeitgeist that's contained in Monopoly. You don't play Monopoly at work. There's a time and a history in the board game that goes nowhere else, right? But you see, if the system can't think different times, different modes of time, then it's going to have to conflate terms like celebration that might require a kairos time with a version of it that's chronological, like winning, like getting at the end of it, which thus then sets you up socially to win versus to celebrate in this sense. And again, that also, I am thinking of Joseph Piper's book, and then I'll give it to Mr. Luber on leisure, because he talks about the end of the festival, right? And the idea that leisure is a matter not of sitting in a recliner, leisure is a matter of festival. The festival, like the meaning crisis is a festival crisis, ultimately, which is a leisure crisis, which is a time energy crisis, which also, though, is a lack of the capacity to have or to make a festival, right? And it is very interesting. Like, people don't do festivals anymore. Like, communities don't have Christmas festivals. I mean, you don't see the festival, which in of itself is kind of a testament to our focuses on winning. We don't have time for a festival because we got to complete our career and win. We got to get the most money. We can't be taking time off to have a festival. We'll lose if we do that. So there's a way in which the zeitgeist suggests the festival, the celebration, is a threat to the winning. And under that circumstance, I think you're in huge trouble. Like, if celebration is something that gets in the way of winning, then you are conditioned to win something that at the end of you'll have nothing to celebrate, which seems like a really terrible Kafka story. But let me give it to Mr. Andrew Luber. Mr. Luber, I hope you're getting paid $900 now that you're doing this level of dog whispering.
That would be amazing. But unfortunately, the system has a stranglehold on the amount of money I can have. So, so that's a no. But that was really beautifully said at the end there, Daniel. Totally, I can see the Kafka. It's tough not taking notes. Okay, so Michael, so like something, Michael, when you brought up like the strike, like, so like I think a lot of my thinking is the moment where we have to really think about what the strike is. That's basically when like thinking meets being, when reflection meets practice, these in between spaces that seem to be necessary for each entity in the relation to even exist in the first place. I think like a problem with having an answer or an absolution, I think that's what he says, an absolution to having the strike and how to understand the strike, is that, again, it becomes a process. And like when it becomes a process, instantly the Play-Doh ball doesn't become Play-Doh anymore. It squishes through your fingers. So like I think if there's a process that's okay, first you got to do this, and then we got to change that. It's like it's at that point we've gotten some healing, a moment of grace, but it seems to me that it immediately jump like the problem and then jumps in front of itself, and then we start all over again. So I'm trying to get my thinking to the point of what is non-process thinking that still has practical effect. Like, is there a process thinking that doesn't have a practical effect? So to me, if you have this, like, if the process is in the non-linear space dimension of the strike, then it seems like it's not going to have this tangible process aspect where the problem gets ahead of itself the second you institute that process. So it's like shifting from, okay, what can we tangibly do? Like, what process can we tangibly do? To like, what we're doing, what are the enduring quality, like features of what we're doing, and how do we have a process of understanding that enduring feature? That to me seems to be like the first shift that I'm trying to get my thinking, at least for me personally. Maybe I'm just dead fucking wrong, but like shifting where we situate process in processing, so to speak. So like that's the first move, putting process in the nonlinear, the infinity, the enduring feature dimension. Then it's like, okay, the tangible linear dimension. How do we approach that? What? Hey, Maya, relax. And chaos strikes right when I'm thinking. Fuck. And I'm walking this beautiful Belgian German Shepherd here. The problem where I'm at with my thinking is in this tangible dimension. How do we approach it in a non-process way? Are there categories that we need to situate? I'm like completely lost, to be honest, in terms of how to approach like the linear space, because the second you actually have a concrete approach, it seems like a process where it self-effaces eventually and it's not applicable to most people. It actually destroys most people and it only benefits few. Kind of like what Philip was saying about these people in power putting laws that like ease their anxiety and problems and whatnot, but actually makes it a lot worse for most other people. So the problem that I'm having with this approach to the tangible space is how we understand context sets in the first place. I used to love set theory. I am now thinking lately that set theory is part of the problem, that it makes the tangible features way too process oriented, where we have an enumeration of sorts, and that enumeration is countable. So then my mind's like, okay, it's not just the context set. It's like the problem is counting, how we even go about counting. And then I'm like, all right, I'm really fucking lost. Like, I don't know what to do. Because, like, I can't think, like, counting seems to be pretty one for one, literally. Like, there's one dog, or there's one, there's this amount of hair, there's a certain quality with certain quantity that matches a certain quality that you're trying to count. So I'm not really sure, but I hope I'm articulating what I think the problem is, and that also one of the first steps is shifting where we situate process in the nonlinear, in the infinity, and yeah, I'll pass it off.
I have this image of Andrew going through town, and there's somebody walking their dog, and they're like, "Hey, I'll walk that for you. Yeah, I'll walk that dog for you. How much? $3.50. I just need $3.50." And I would get it. Okay, I'll do your Loch Ness Monster. It'll be fine. So I just see you going through town, hustling all the dog owners. Be like, "Hey, I'm the best walker in town, baby. You don't need to be walking your dog. Oh man, look at your strut. That's so slow. For frick's sake." So just a German Shepherd. Okay, why not? Next, you're gonna be walking a sheep. You're gonna be like, hey, that could be, dude, diversify your market. There could be like alpacas and sheep. Who knows what else you can freaking walk? There's no telling. You said a lot there that was really good. I can't. It is interesting, the joke or wit, where you go into a situation. Is a joke a judgment? Is a judgment processed? An intuition, is that process, right? There is something where I wonder if one of the key roles to creating a feeling of celebration and festivity is the capacity to walk into a linear space and to judge a joke and to tell a joke or wit, because it's not really counting or process, and it's not really reducible to set. You're making a judgment that then brings a certain life and festivity to the temporal, right? And this, we've talked about wit. I do think the joke is actually a very powerful tool as a revelation of the timeless within the sequential, because it's really hard. Like a good comedian who reads an audience, how do they do it? Like, how is it a sequential thing? They have some sort of like judgment, apprehension, intuition that is not reducible to a process, and they also take a risk, and they don't know that it's going to work. That's the key. A joke is calculated and yet not at the same time in a weird way, right? Like you don't know the outcome and yet you do it. And people who are really good do it a lot. And it does kind of break up the monotony and yet doesn't, and then allows the monotony to come back, right? I do think a role of the philosopher is to introduce feelings of friendship and festivity to people's lives. I do think that's quite important because philosophers who like say, I'm going to tell you truth and don't introduce a feeling of friendship, festivity, and laughter, you can keep your truth, buddy. That's great. Like there's something about the capacity to, hey, look, I can enter a situation and make it fun, or I know how to bring a dance, or I know how to bring wit. Jock, and we've talked about wit and Aristotle as being so important. I do wonder if wit is part of this. The capacity of wit to bring into a situation. I don't think wit is reducible to set theory, and yet it honors set theory. It doesn't say set theory is wrong. It says set theory is the stage of the comedian. It's the stage on which the wit occurs. But then the wit could be wrong, right? Like it's really hard to know what jokes are going to be funny and what aren't going to be funny, what things people are going to enjoy and what not they're going to enjoy, and yet you take the leap of faith anyway. You take that risk. So it is interesting to, I was thinking about that. I think also, I do think philosophy, we've talked before about friendship as big friends, bum, 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 bum. I do think festival, like there's a similar thing where one is trying to create the conditions of festivity that do point to a time within this time and already not yet. I also wanted to say and then I'll give it to Philip and then Mr. Jockin. I do think there's something about a good party that is a way to fight the apocalypse. Like if we want to fight the apocalypse as human beings or the technological singularity, then we need to put on a really good festival. Like that's the way, man. Because there's something about the festival. Because look, like when you find festivals or you're having fun or philosophy or friendship, then it's kind of like, yeah, we don't want the world to be reduced to capital. But if you're bored and sad and you won a lot of money, you don't really care, right? There's something about having a good time that makes you care to stop the, smashing of the human race into nothing, right? Into paper clips or something like that, right? Now, again, a good festival, though, is more than happy to include paper clips if it helps us put together the piñata. So they have a role, but we don't want to be the paper clips. We want to have piñatas. But let me give it to Mr. Philip Shinn and then Thomas Jockett. Mr. Shinn.
Yeah, I think it's the Luber when it comes to like linear stuff, thinking Gelassenheit, right? This idea of letting be, specifically when it comes to like a Whiteheadian appetition and apperception, which is to say the understanding of pattern as such, knowing that we've all internalized the super ego. So to be like, no, not that, no, not that, no, not that. The line in, oh, everyone loves it, Osho's Tantra, the Supreme Understanding, is drawn between activity and action, which I think the Bible will call like Mary and Martha. And the idea being like, we're doing all these things to pass time because there's a restlessness inside of us versus these moments, these Bedouin events that would allow a transformation in the existential situation through an act, after which we'll never be the same. And what do you do in the in-between time, right? You doom scroll? Do you just like sit around and like look at a tree? You stack bread, like what are you doing? And each culture and each time will have like a set of kind of acceptable activities. And all I'm saying is like nowadays it feels like those are, like Daniel was saying, like they are so weakening our biophysiology that our ability to celebrate, it's like, man, I really want to. And you like take one step and you're like, oh, this hurts. And then you think about your existence and you're like, oh, it all hurts. Maybe if I pop a couple pills, then I can party. Then you pop the pills and you're watching Netflix and you're like, how did that happen? What? But when you're watching the Netflix, you get rewarded because you go to your friends and you guys are like having this small talk and they're like, oh yeah, whatever, Bridgerton, etc. And like this type of stuff is happening on top of the internalized achievement subject that is like if I'm not constantly maximizing my time, you know, and I'm not saying like this stuff happens consciously. I don't think it does. I don't think like people are really like even that interested in becoming aware of it just because it's so scary. It's actually really, really scary. When you think like in order for me to be okay, all this stuff has to happen. And you're like, well, that can't happen to every inhabitant of the earth. Ergo, existential guilt, right? Uh, and I think a lot of people will just like paper that over. There's like, it's not, repress, disavow. Yeah, exactly. I'm making my money, like I got a nice apartment. It's cool. Nothing to see here. So how to like with the linear thinking, where I'm talking about using the psychotic discourse to get to the outside, but not like what Daniel says to keep the headphones on, so that's all you're hearing. More in this idea of der Geleute Stille, the ringing silence that Heidegger talks about, which might be something like the voice of God, which might be something like the new paradigm that can only be heard through an emptying. So creating that emptiness, I think, comes just from like a lot of no saying. And then I think Chesterton comes in where like you have to love the world enough that you want to change it and hate it enough that you want to change it. So like don't hate people who aren't able to do that, like who are just going with the Das Mann conformist life. Like don't waste your energy being like, you gotta read Bataille. And they're like, dude, I'm just gonna watch movies and drink beer, and that'll be my life. And kind of like rather than attacking what you perceive to be darkness, moving toward a more light-filled existence for yourself. And then just that's the leap. And it's like, well, this might not be worth it, but it might be. So roll the dice.
That's very well put. I'll give it to Mr. Jog. Well, there's an idea in which, again, beauty attracts, set a table, a feast, and if they want to sit down, like, are you using philosophy to create a festival or to collect glass beads, right? Like, if you're not using it to set a table that people can sit at and have a meal or have a good time, then, yeah, you're not doing it right. I really do think that many people get into philosophy, one, because they find it necessary as self-defense against ideology. Two, it helps them increase their wonder. Three, it helps them avoid drama in relationships. There's all some sort of trying to maintain celebration in life because human beings with their frenemy brain tend towards something like entropy. Without effort, we seem to fall into a life that's hard to celebrate. And one ends up in philosophy because they want to try to maintain the work of keeping life something that can be celebrated, which is not easy or self-evident, and you have the challenges of money. That you have to deal with as well. But then the philosopher, I think people who do philosophy realize that if you win the game of money, you don't necessarily celebrate. Winning at money doesn't mean you celebrate. I think that is a key dimension of many philosophers. Something happened in their life that made them realize if you win at money or security or all these things does not necessarily mean you win overall as a human being. Oh, well, and if you ask people, hey, how do we actually win though? And then you're like, nobody knows. Oh, crap. Very few people know this. Well, maybe some of the smartest people in history would know. So I think a lot of people that get in philosophy, something occurred that then has made them like realize there's a problem that no one in their immediate knows the answers to. So they're looking everywhere. And I think that's a key. There's a break, or there's an experience of beauty. There's a trauma. There's a cross. There's something that makes you go, oh my gosh, there's a real problem here. And no one seems to know what to do. Crap. I guess we're gonna have to think it through. But but how will we know when we found the answer? So you just have to keep doing it. Because you don't have the authority giving it to you. I think yeah, I mean, I would just also say it's very hard to put on festivals if no one around you will. Like it becomes difficult if it's not communally, like if you don't have a culture that says on this Saturday, we're going to do this, and everyone has permission by the cultural zeitgeist, like a Sabbath, to not work. Like the holidays is because holidays are like on Christmas. It's okay if you don't work. Really? I'm not lazy if I don't work on Christmas? No, it's socially acceptable. And you can also spend a little extra more money than you usually do and have people come. It gives you a permission, right? It is very difficult if you no longer have feast days or festivals or all these different things to do that, because you are going against the permissions of the zeitgeist, right? Which then, if you need festivals to be able to tell the difference between winning and celebration, it becomes difficult to create the models of that difference, and then everyone atomizes to win at a game that has nothing to celebrate. So I think there's a social dimension here that maybe the social coordinating mechanism can help with. I think, look, in Judaism, this is the awareness of the Sabbath. It's like, if you don't say, you can't work, you aren't allowed to work, then social pressures are such where people are going to make each other just because of competitive game dynamics, right? Like that's an advantage of having something like the Sabbath part of your very cultural structure, because then everyone is doing it and you don't have to make excuses for why you didn't answer that email on the Sabbath. Well, I didn't answer the email on the Sabbath, John, because it was the Sabbath, right? It's not because I'm lazy. So it gives you a cultural permission. This was something religions, I think, knew. There's always that Zizekian metaphysical violence. If you're free to do something, then you're responsible if you don't. And if you're free to answer an email at 12 at night and you don't, then you're responsible for not answering the email at night. But if the culture says it's the Sabbath, you are free, right? From the freedom of answering it and being responsible for if you don't answer it or not, right? We've removed all of that, which then makes it very difficult to gather people together to put things together like festivals or community or friendship. We tried to put and the other thing, the zoning and regulations don't help either, because when we tried to put together like an open mic downtown Charlottesville during TomTom, you would have thought it was the freaking apocalypse. What do you mean you want to amplify a speaker downtown near the restaurants? People are drinking wine. You're going to try to have an open mic downtown? You monster. Like trying to have nifty things like in a festival, in a community, the small government's like, nah. So you also do have a bureaucratic dimension here that's very difficult. We were, after much teeth pulling, able to do poetry in motion, where we had poetry on the buses. This was very hard. Like just random people reading poetry on the bus. They looked at us and like, if anyone dies, you will go to jail forever. It's like, guys, we're just trying to read Wallace Stevens on a transient system, for frick's sake. So it doesn't help when you have a cultural zeitgeist that makes it difficult to make these spaces, and the city governments don't want to do it because the money is found in the old people going to restaurants on a Friday and drinking wine, and they don't like listening to hip hop. So, you're going to have a hip hop open mic. We're going to lose revenue on our wine drinkers. So no, you can't do that. Well, then downtown's pretty boring. Yeah, we like it boring. That's how we make more money. So there is a governmental structure that's part of this. And then also, I always think it's interesting if Revelation has something with a breaking of logistical time. There's something about Revelation that might be like wit. Like God's like breaking in, but it's like catching it. Revelation comes forward, changes the character, but it continues. I do think the event is more like a joke than it is like a transformation of everything. Like an event kind of comes in like a wit moment within the sequence that unveils something. So the character of the joke and wit might be useful to think the problem that Mr. Luber put forth. But let me give it to the wonderful Mr. Jock. And Mr. Jock, it is so good to see you on this fine day, sir.
Good to see everybody. Good to see everybody.
Good to see you, sir.
So let's circle back, Daniel. Your notes very much remind me of the nature of risk and liability. That is always the death of creativity. Creativity cannot respond, or it's very seriously trampled down or stampled by risk and liability. Specifically, the attempts to try to manage it. That's basically what I'm hearing here. Another big one is kind of indifference and ambiguity, right? Because that is always the great problem here, is that generally when a circumstance is appearing, when it's uncertain, unclear, there's a great deal of ambiguity involved. And for most people, they don't want to deal with it. They want the program given to them. And usually what happens there's a calculation, a protocol with measures and basically dictums of how to respond to it. And then people love that. It gives most people direction. But what's fascinating is almost always, whenever that happens, there's always a lacking property. Something, because in the nature of limitation, there's always something demarcated away to be something affirmed. And And that generally, and what's funny is that usually people are perfectly fine with a metric, a measure in the beginning, because it's the job done. But when they actually push on it or see the consequences of that measure, actually, Phil brought it up. For example, if you're having body pain, isn't it fascinating? The metric, the solution, the inferential, the almost the antheneme. I'm reading rhetoric and poetics from Aristotle right now again, so I'm reminded of this. The antheneme of when one's body is hurting, one should go to a doctor to get medication to treat it, not change your diet, not exercise, not these other things. That's really fascinating. No one told anyone that. See, that's funny about amphetamines. What's really fascinating about them is no one's ever told them. We just infer and pick them up from our culture. And I agree with you, Daniel, your notion that generally people with the philosophical persuasion is because there's been some crisis, some failure, or some breakage of, I followed the program, it didn't work for whatever reason, for various domains and practical points about it. But I think a big part of it is, a lot of times, a big part of the protocol of capital and labor is to say your needs are satisfied by your job, and everything that you need can be acquired by capital. And the more you contribute to that and generate more capital and transform your activities into capital productions of kinesis, not anageas, because that's a big, Aristotle gave us a distinction: production versus praxis, kinesis versus anageia. That language existed for a reason. They kind of summarize the point. You producing something for some indefinite end, you eating, right? You're going to have to eat again. Like this has a repetitional process that has to just go on over and over again. That's indefinite. And money was always considered historically very suspicious for this exact reason. Like, because the whole point was that, producing, like, you making a good concretely for someone was considered a very moral good thing. You trading money for widget for widget X for widget Y, and you got a money exchange from that, very suspicious, super suspicious. And God forbid you actually just use interest. Holy shit. That was, listen, Islam still to this day does not permit interest payments. It does not allow it. In the Catholic Church, in the Christianity, it was only up until the Middle Ages that was changed. Interest was incredibly suspicious because it had this quality of an absolute indefiniteness. If you played that game, you entered into not a closed game, but an open game. And that's it. And once that happens, now you're facing infinity. And human beings are not very good at it because there's always the question of there's always a larger number. There's always a larger number. And actually, I'm on the position, I'm not surprised. Once we assign the measure of success and the anthenemes of all your problems will be solved by how much money you have and who has the most stuff or the most money is how we determine the winner of things. I am not surprised we end up in the operations that we have at all. And most simply is the hedonic treadmill. Right? That's a very obvious, dangerous point. It's so if all your needs can be met by quantitative measurements that are mediated through capital and money, and then through the exchanges of money, you can get all your pleasures, and that's always the problem, is that money inherently is a sign of demand, right? That's the language Aristotle uses. And it's what's very difficult about that. There are some things that money cannot buy. A very crass point, quite frankly, paying someone to eat a meal with you is not the same as your friends coming and joining you to eat a meal together. It could be exactly the same cost. You can even offer to pay for that friend's meal. You know what I mean? Like, it could be all the mechanics of the capital spend and all that. But isn't it interesting that this kind of inescapable subjectivity, personhood quality of a measure that's beyond money is in play? Because that's exactly what's going on there. I think of that that's kind of the problem, is that we got psyched. It didn't work. We got psyched out. We got completely psyoped to not realize that the qualities of friendship, and Aristotle had all these notes. Listen, the change of honor for money was there for a reason. Quite honestly, this is why the kind of that old school attitude prior to the Protestant Reformation and Protestant work ethic of, it was actually uncouth of you to have to work because you should be exchanged in honor. That should be your currency. That should be what should be exchanged, not money. You're a slave. You're basically a slave or the lower tier of society. If you got to exchange money for things, you should be exchanging honor for things. That was the Aristotelian or the classical aristocratic point of view. Now we've replaced that, and there's certain virtues of doing that. Generally more democratic, more equality of access, of excellence in that sense. But there is something lost of these kind of qualities of friendship and family and relations that just seem completely unreasonable to be purchased. You can't buy a friend. Like that, to kind of capture the spirit of what we're talking about, what I'm getting at here. And that leads to a very important thing. I brought this up many months ago. The contention of the prize and the praise in Aristotle immediately comes to mind on this. There are certain things that are praised, right? There's a kind of like strength, for example, is praised, right? But to be prized is something that cannot be taken away. It's like a thing. It's the issue of possessionness of property that cannot be taken away. Like a deep loving relationship to a grandfather that taught you how to fish, and you go fishing and you have the recollection of being taught that, and you teach your own son that lesson of fishing. That is to be prized. Like it's something that cannot be taken away from you, because it has a deeper penetrative quality to it than the idea of like learning how to fish, paying someone to learn how to fish, right? That leads to like another note of kind of something I've been reading in the poetics, specifically the poetics and rhetoric, is human beings is very fascinating property that via games, in narrative and poetry and all these operations of fiction of fictitious spaces, we create simulations for learning. That's the basic proposition made by Aristotle and all these lessons. This is why the aesthetic experience is not to be considered this completely non-knowledgeable thing. Plato, and I would argue Plato also has a similar position too. But Aristotle gives a much more systematic argumentation about it. Here's what happens. By producing games and building narratives, we build simulations that we can learn from. We can learn from experiences that are not our direct experience. That's actually huge. That's basically what makes us human, ultimately. Because the fact, especially the technology of reading, like we can build little symbolic scribbles that do not actually represent the things where the names of things are not actually the things themselves, but for their simulational structures. We can create basically experiences of understanding the phantasms in our minds. And we can learn from those, especially when there's moral or valuations being made in them, especially, but in the general cases. That's actually really powerful, because especially if in philosophical writing, not narrative, just pure narrative writing, that's a more simplified form of it, but the more advanced philosophical is to present new paradigms of thought of how we can engage and consider things. So to kind of circle all this back, ultimately, when you realize that the programs and protocols of how we're supposed to carry out our lives are lacking, the philosophical project is meant to present possibilities, meant to bring up images to the mind to think through what are alternative possibilities, especially of what is to be prized, the things that are truly worth championing one's life around, that find beautiful. I think those, and especially when trying to dig out, actually, and I think, by the way, Philip, your original point, a kind of historical project of reviewing the nature of work, it's totally true. We work way more than we ever did in the past, ever. That requires a historical perspective to see that. But once you see that, you can start asking questions. Is what we've known and kind of biased, and kind of because we're always biased of what we already know, we think what we experience is reliable? Maybe not, because you need historical reference points to give you measures. Isn't that experience interesting? By using a reference, by looking at a different reference point, you recontextualize where you stand, and you don't take it as a given, right? So thus the forgetfulness becomes recollected and memorialized and remembered, and that leads to an operational choice, right? A transformation of usually kind of how we simulate, present ourselves, the images to understand ourselves and other people and how we relate and what we work on together. I think that's actually, kind of drawn from the last one of the Stoics. They were so important about this, of framing the mind by presenting the phantasms, the images in the mind to shape it in a mode of gratefulness, of thankfulness, right? That is actually a very important quality, because what you are grateful for is context specific and reference point. And actually a good cult method of that is modes of recollection. The Stoics were very important, very emphatic about that point of cultivating the mind and the soul for virtue based on that. So I'm just thinking through all this. And by the way, humor is I just last note because GZAC is my classic example. I just referenced before to a friend I recently the GZAC's a discussion about toilet design and ideology. It's hilarious. And people were laughing during the entire lecture about it. And he admitted it was completely ridiculous. It was comical what he was doing, but it was very captivating and led to a very interesting question. How are built spaces shaped by the norms and ideologies and expectations of our cultures that we work in? I think those are very powerful points. And with that, I stop.
Magnificent. I'll pass it to Mr. Luber and then Philip Shinn. If anyone has final things to say, please. I have obligations this evening. I've enjoyed it immensely. I think a lot of what you were saying on games, narrative, poetry, I think I think someone who does philosophy realizes at some point in their life they have to do that. Like, or else there will be consequences. It's very interesting. Like, when a child is playing with something, which may or may not be based on experience, they tend to look at it, they tend to figure it out. So they're learning to solve the end that they want to do. It's all in physicality, right? Something happens, I think, at some point where you realize, oh my gosh, there are like problems that occur that are a result of ideas, things I cannot hold. So I have to think them and then move them around, and like just like moving around the block in my hand to figure out how it fits in the hole. Ideas are like that, and it's really hard to see their shape, and it's really hard to see the hole that they're going to fit in. But if I don't, there's going to be trouble. So you come to almost realize that as a child, if I would just kind of, use a metaphor, as a child learns fiddling, tinkering until it works. And when you realize that because we are not omniscient, a lot of the problems in life we encounter, we have to figure out by tinkering. Children just do this. I think the philosopher is the person who goes, oh my gosh, we have to tinker with ideas. Like we have to tinker with blocks, and they're invisible and they're hard to see. And it's even hard to know how to tinker with them. I think I'll just pretend like I don't need to do this. And so you retract and go back to just letting ideas idea themselves. And that works for a bit. And then one day it doesn't. And then you're like, crap. And I think eventually you're convinced of the necessity of tinkering with ideas, both to avoid trouble, both to increase beauty, to not conflate things that will make your life less happy or lead to trouble, to maintain friendship. There's a notion that philosophy is a kind of tinkering with something invisible, that if you don't tinker with, you're in trouble. And so I really like that. I think, and then I'll give it to Mr. Luber and then Mr. Shinn. I think there is that moment, again, with philosophy, I would just say, in the play Hecuba, where the character comes back and finds out her best friend killed her son, and she's looking around on the ship and says, everything I see is untrustworthy. I can't trust anything. And gradually is reduced to an animal because of the inability to trust. I think the philosopher has a moment where they go, everything is trying to trick me, including myself, and it's nobody's fault. Oh gosh, there's this sort of like everything has a certain abysmalness first, and you either go crazy, or you figure out like Hecuba, or you figure out how to claw yourself back to the human being once you realize this thing is in operation. Everything is trying to trick me, including myself, and it's nobody's fault. Or it's the fault of a collective of decentralized agents that don't have it's this collective intelligence that is leading to this zeitgeist that has a certain agency, like capital in the Nick Land sense, perhaps. Or what is it? The Roku being in the future that's pulling us, like Land talks about the Roku experiment or whatever. But let me give it to Philip and then Mr. Luber. Mr. Philip Shinn, and again, if anyone has final things, please let me know. Mr. Shinn.
Tricks are for kids, man. There's like definitely a childish way of doing this where I think it was in Phaedo when he says something like, beware of disputatious debaters. And I think Layman Pascal does a good job of resuscitating a post-Gödel Platonic form idea with 99 as the new 100%, right? So it's like, we are inside language games, and I know Wittgenstein and Zizek are both fans of Weininger, who was Hitler's favorite Jew, I think, because he killed himself. And he wrote a book called Sex and Character that's all about like the only way for a human to live in the 20th century is to try to become a spiritual genius. Like otherwise there's going to be no point to your life. And his next assertion was like, a Jew and a woman can't do this. And I think it was some letter I saw from Wittgenstein that was basically like when he says like those words, he's talking about uh, cultural caricatures that go on in certain zeitgeists that enslave people. And so this idea of like otium et bellum, like you couldn't be free if you were concerned about, whatever subsistence in the physical form. That's just not what the Greeks called a free man. And that was at that point in time only available to certain property bearing men. But now it may be available to more people, and more people might be like, oh, this is actually very difficult because we're stepping out of the Girardian scapegoat model, and like this abyss seems to be like a different kind of anxiety than me getting upset that my neighbor just got the new Land Rover and I just have a 2020 Porsche and I don't know how to sleep tonight. So I'm gonna, invest, take out some debt to get a few more rental properties. And anyone who comes along and says something like, hey, trying to do MMM prime is actually like the move of a slave, according to someone like Aristotle. They would just be like, Lahu Zer. Like, okay, fine. You're just like not living in that world, right? I'm out here trying to get my tree fitted. And it's like that, I think is going to keep happening. Like that is in its own sort of self-perpetuating fractal dynamic that is going to continue to lose reference in the real world. And so I think it's like both of those things is existing at the same time. And then phenomenologically opening the door to someone who's like, hey, can I come to this party? When like all they want to talk about at the party is the yacht they bought, the house they bought, like all this kind of stuff. Like how then do you I don't know if it's an initiation, right? If it's like a gatekeeping question, but like make it so that it's not like whatever. I don't think it's Snowball, but whoever comes in with the dogs and is like, yo, now I'm gonna make you all my workers. So that the party doesn't get changed into a sort of Arbeit macht frei type camp. And I think that's I don't know if that's even, it'll be interesting to see once the screens go away. Because I think something's coming that's going to be less biologically deleterious. And but this is again like a best of times, worst of times. Like Jock, and what you were saying with, okay, who is it? Is it a doctor's job to take care of my health? Or is this like an instance where like personal responsibility is more important when it comes to me dealing with like chronic things and anything acute? I go and do that. And we build culture this way. That's like, hey, if you want to build your mind and your body, that's on you. If you want to be housed and have acute medical care, that's like something the community will maybe look at. But yeah, those distinctions, while they're like still sorting themselves out, I think the play is something like celebrate any, like for no reason. If there's no reason, great. If there is, great. And I think that's like maybe allows the philosopher to have more wit in certain scenarios rather than this like perversion of someone's frame, which is just like way just like very simple to do. Like you pervert the frame and then you use rhetoric to, win when you move the goalposts. Um, but yeah, I still think the question of scale when it comes to that is like gigundo. So no answers, just questions, really.
No, I think that's all well put, and I'll give it to Luber, and then alas have to go. I think what you were saying about, well, first, the philosopher should be going into a space like to create an opening of celebration and to help people move into the place to experience infinity versus totality and beauty, versus like I'm going to convince them that Hegel's a great mind, or I'm going to convince them they should read the philosophy of right? Like one should be going into a space to shine with possibilities of celebration that may look like wit or joke or banter or fest. Like you say, if you are contingent on when you will celebrate or why you will celebrate, then you are contingent on when you will shine with the reasons for why people should come into philosophy. You shouldn't lead with, I read Hegel. There should be a certain way of being that people see, and then they find out you read Hegel. That should be secondary. If you lead with that, then it tends to feel problematic, right? It doesn't work. Like it is about that sort of invitation into the festival, right? Yeah, there you Miss Parson. I think also what you were saying about the anxiety of not dealing with wage labor, Joneses. I do wonder if the Joneses actually have any money, or if they just lock their house and everyone assumes the Jones have it. That's why you're always keeping up with them, because you never meet them, and so no matter what happens, they're ahead. It's the black box thing, right? I think also, yeah, basically, we use wages to make one another understandable. There's the compression of facts, so we can deal with pluralism, which if we want to move to something like honor or a higher understanding of one another, we would have to have the capacities to handle that, right? And that creates anxiety and is quite difficult. So this is where you need a mode of consciousness to be able to take on the fullness of people. Otherwise, wages, capital, and all that are an information technology through compression that makes the other more understandable so that I can get along with you. And if I don't like that, well, then I have to get along with you when you're not compressed. Well, that's hard. All right, well, then don't complain. So I think that's part of the challenge. And then scaling that would require, is very difficult and gets into things like the social coordinating mechanism that has to exist dialectically with the effectiveness of the pricing mechanism so that it doesn't become flattening as such. But let me give it to Mr. Luber, and then alas, I will have to run. Mr. Luber, I hope that you are just raining the Benjamins.
I'm just finished with my last dog. This has been a great conversation. I wanted to comment on what Jaka was saying about the human's relationship to infinity, using the friendship example. And then I want to tie in basically my proposition of situating process in the nonlinear and not the linear, because ironically, when you're in the experience, what particular things need to happen will reveal itself. So I think you're right. Humans have a very like arduous relationship to infinity, to the nonlinear in a certain sense, but at the same time, there's a certain aspect where they have actually a very harmonious relationship to the infinity. So like the friendship example, if you pay someone to have dinner with you, it's just not going to hit the same as you buying your friend dinner and you having, quality time. Now, do you need to buy your friend dinner in order to have the quality time? No, but any particular aspect can't be reduced to why you are friends with said person per se. So the interesting thing about situating process in the nonlinear, like processing what the enduring feature is, that the enduring feature of why you're friends with so and so. The irony there is the process will not be some like tangible thing that you could just say every single time they do da, 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 da. It's you are the the process, the processing the enduring feature has to do with you just desiring what the other desires, like, and it being something broad in that way. Because when a particular situation comes up with your friend, this process of the linear will generate a reveal of, I mean, this process of the nonlinear will generate a particular action, decision, choice that needs to be made in the linear. And that to me is like why process needs to be in the nonlinear, not in the linear where it typically is understood to be. And also, when you say process, you think of like 1, 2, 3, 4. When you think of process of the nonlinear, it's not a 1, 2, 3, 4. It's more of a general command concept of sorts. So that I just wanted to say, in that respect, we do have, like, I'm friends with my friends not for any particular reason. There is something that is beyond my immediate understanding to why I'm friends with them. Like, oh, I'm friends with them because they can make me laugh. There's this can quality that friends have, not an is quality that friends have, where the isness of friends is situated in the fact that there is a can in general. A friend can be X, and that's like the process aspect of the nonlinear. So I wanted to just quickly squeeze that in, and then also, like, I love your commentary on Daniel on the Civil War and just the thinking that you do with that. It just making me think that generating like AI, we're just trying to create the slave. We're trying to create this distant other in order for us to have leisure time. That seems to be like an obvious possibility. But if that is an obvious possibility, why is it the case that so many people think that we are going to be self-effaced by AI? Why is it so difficult to see, oh yeah, we can have genuine leisure time? I guess maybe because we don't have a sense of honor. Like, we don't know how to judge honor in society. So maybe that's a possible reason. And then if that is the case, why not why, how do we have an understanding and approach to honor that when we have this quote unquote AI slave that will give the possibility of leisure time, that we're able to actually indeed have leisure time and not be this like horrifying existential boredom of just eating ourselves essentially. So I kind of wanted to have that question. And if you don't have time, I totally understand. I just wanted to throw that out there, and then my thoughts on the infinity nonlinear shit. But yeah, this is good.
No, very well put. And alas, I will have to run here. Well, in a funny way, the AI question you pose kind of proves Hegel's point that the slave has the power, because the AI, precisely in being the ultimate slave, simultaneously has the ultimate power because it brings the Ivan Illich disablement. If AI can do all of X for you, that means you can't do X, or if you can, you can't do it as well as the AI. So you better hope there's something that you can do that the AI cannot do, or it will have a power. Oh, that it will have a power you don't. Which then, of course, I think brings to the forefront what you were saying about the friendship and the non-lineality and different things, because ultimately, I think what it comes down to is when you talk about friendship or festival, or you're talking about quality versus quantity, and you can't quantify it, and yet it's a quality that is a result of the quantity. And so then I think it moves to a true infinity versus a spurious, because the quality adds a vertical dimension to the horizontal of the set, and you're actually referring that way, right? So there's a quality that all of the quantities are themselves in light of, and yet you can't reduce the quality to, right? So likewise, the issue is, what is the quality that human beings and AI in relation to can generate that is not reducible to either, that then is going to bind the relationship of a certain character and possibility that will feel mutually beneficial versus one-sided of a Hegelian master-slave dialectic disablement. And then also, like, well, AI just forces the question, what are you doing with your time? Okay, you have time. What are you doing with it? And that means you have to make a decision. And the whole reason I made AI is so I don't have to make decisions. It's going to make decisions for me. Well, it can't make that decision for you, can it? Not really, because what AI would, you'd have to ask, maybe you could say, AI, can you tell me what I can do that you can't do? But that's kind of weird. And AI is like, well, if I can tell you that, then I'd be doing that thing because I know what it is, right? So there's this weird sort of circular problem which that comes to the forefront. But then, of course, you say, well, then, you know, wage labor is an ethical advancement. Yes, but it doesn't in of itself deal with the quality problem because wage trains you out of the capacity to think according to quality, right? It is an ethical advancement because it broke down the racial hierarchy, but it did so by equalizing the wages, which then, of course, unlocked prosperity and GDP and different things and had some benefits, but it did not deal with this quality problem because that requires a human problem and a certain training and a certain conditionality that is not natural or easy, but it seems to have something aligned with the friendship and the festival and being open to those possibilities. And I think that's the work we have to do now. So I appreciate the conversation. And I think that's something to celebrate. So thank you all. Always a pleasure. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.